Hello, and welcome to Accessing Authors, a Windsor Public Library roundtable video series featuring our local authors. Join us as we tap into the minds and processes that build your favorite literary worlds. Chapter 4, Patrick Brode.
All right, so for the people who are just joining us now, welcome to another installment of Accessing Authors. Today we will be speaking with Patrick Brode, a local historian and local lawyer. So, Mr. Brode, you have been pretty well a lifelong resident of Windsor. You live here, you practice law here. But more of interest to us is your writing. In the past, you've written 5 books about the history of law in Canada, including Sir John Beverley Robinson, Bone and Sinew of the Compact, and that was a finalist for the City of Toronto Book Award. Similarly, you wrote a work called The Odyssey of John Anderson, and that was a finalist for the Trillium Award. More recently, you've turned your pen to recording local history. You have Border Cities Powerhouse, The Rise of Windsor, 1900 to 1945, and that was shortlisted for the 2017 Ontario Speakers Book Award. You've been twice nominated for the Crime Writers of Canada, their Arthur Ellis Award, and 2010 for The Slasher Killings, A Canadian Sex Crimes Panic, again 1945, 1946, and then most recently 2019 for Dying for a Drink, How a Prohibition Preacher Got Away with Murder. And it's just interesting to see in our local media that they were kind of celebrating an anniversary relating to that event. So we'll start. We've got our third panelist just coming in now. Chris, why don't you start and tell us a bit about yourself, and then you can ask your first question of Mr. Brode, maybe a follow-up question, and then we'll move to other panelists.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I am a local historian, and I've been in Windsor since I was 10 years old. I'm now 60. And it's a great historical place. I love this county. There's so much history here, and I've been able to write about a lot of it myself, but it's also really good. I really enjoy reading everybody else's stories about the Windsor and Essex County and that, and they're definitely not what I've been writing about. So that's why I really appreciate it myself. I write on certain topics. Yeah. Anyway, I believe I have 6 or 7 of your books. I enjoy them. I've used a couple for references, which is always nice. And, we've been doing so much in Windsor and Essex County on the history of the area, and there's many good books out there. But as a historian, I wondered what your opinion is on like saving some of these older buildings.
Your question, Chris, is with regard to saving buildings in the community. And boy, I mean, having done some work in law in Windsor, unfortunately, we've obliterated a fair amount. It would be great if we could save some more, and there certainly are a number of ones we're saving. And on the way here, I was going past Our Lady of the Lake Church on Drouillard Road at the river. Not only is a great historical church, and really the center of the French Canadian community in the Windsor area, but the site of the Battle of Ford City in 1917. So great historical significance to it. And thank goodness that Mr. Horowitz jumped in and saved the building. So we've got that for our heritage, hopefully for generations to come. You could say the same thing about Assumption Church. Really one of the most significant buildings, I think, in the province of Ontario, going back to 1845. What a magnificent building it is, and how amazing it must have been back then for people to look at it. So, I think there are a few buildings. Unfortunately, May mentioned the Dying for a Drink book, and of course that was the site of the great roadhouse. Unfortunately, we've had so many roadhouses, especially the one that features so prominently in that one. Yeah, I wish we could have saved more.
Thank you. Yeah, we try our best. I know that there's a few out here in the county that really should be saved, even if they have to be taken out to our heritage village.
Yeah.
But we do what we can, and I just wondered if there was anything in particular that you did think that we should save.
Well, other than those ones I mentioned, and I'm sure that there's many others.
Rob, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and talk to Mr. Brode?
Oh, hi, Mr. Brode. My name is Rob Egan, and I work at Riverside Library. And really, we owe you a debt of gratitude because, we used to have students come into the library and they were bewildered because their teacher had assigned a topic on local history, and it was just very, very hard for them. And so now we've got this great book, this Dying for a Drink, that is going to hook them right from page one. It's got everything in it for them. So really, I just want to thank you for that, because here it is, local history that is readable, that is compelling, and it just gets you from the start and right to the finish. So thanks very much for that.
That's incredibly kind of you. Thank you so much. It's very nice to hear.
Is that still a problem, that local history, do you think, for kids and for younger people is considered to be dull or uninteresting, or it's just something that they want to stay away from? Do you get that kind of resistance?
I don't know. My feeling has always been that if you write it well, if you tell a story, but you don't talk down to your readers. If you actually are telling them an intelligent story and showing where it fits into the framework of history and the rest of the country, they will like it. Not everybody, but I think a lot of people will appreciate it.
Yeah, and I'm not actually from Windsor. I'm from London, Ontario. And when I was growing up, there were a number of killings, and apparently it's just been learned that there may have been in the 60s and 70s 2 serial killers working the streets there. So maybe if you want to spread out, I know you did some historical work on Toronto with the Clara Ford killing and with her trial and so forth, that maybe you want to spread out and do some work in London, because it looks like there's some raw material there for you too.
Oh yes, most of my books are not local history, of course. Most of them are studies in law across the country. And once again, I think it's important that it's be a study not only of a particular event, but also the context of it. The one that you just mentioned in Toronto, the Clara Ford case, was not only a trial of a person, but led to a lot of other incredibly interesting issues about the place of women in society in the 1890s, and the role of what they called in those days deviant sexual behavior.
Sure.
Very taboo stuff back then. So you look at these cases really not as just being a one kind of odd incident, but really, what did it mean for the people who lived at that time? That's what I'm trying to do.
So my question, Mr. Brode, is to start with anyway. We know so many popular novelists have trained as lawyers. So there's Lisa Scott-Aline, there's Scott Turow, there's David Baldacci. And I'm thinking of what Lisa Scott-Aline actually said, quote, "When people ask where I learned to write, I say law school. Writing a novel is like prepping for a trial. Discovery is the research, and from there, the lawyer develops a story that she is going to tell the jury or the reader," unquote. So I wanted to ask you how legal training influenced your writing.
Well, it's strange. It made me reflect when you thought of that question, because I hadn't really considered it before, but it's very true. I think the comments that you just quoted are quite accurate, that legal training, whether you like it or not, kind of bends you into a certain direction. And in my view, it kind of bent me, at least, into having to focus your mind on a particular story. You're trying to explain something to a judge or a jury, and you've got to put it into terms that they can understand. They can see the story. And turning from doing that in a courtroom to doing that in a book, you've got to do the same thing. You just can't lay a bunch of stuff out and hope that they're going to understand it or that it makes sense somehow. You've actually got to give it a focus and a meaning. And you've got to do that in your legal work. Occasionally you have to take things that can be fairly complex and think, it is complex. I've got to make it so somebody else can understand it.
Mhm.
And I think as legal people going into writing, that's what you do as well. And you mentioned a lot of writers who were legally trained or practiced law for a while. Let me throw another one out, Charles Dickens. I mean, Dickens was not a lawyer, but he spent an awful lot of time as a young man in court, as a reporter. So he knew the rhythm, he knew the system, and he knew how much of human nature comes out in legal cases. So it's a great place to train if you're going to go into writing.
What I was really struck by your writing is its concision. You know, so many of your books are slender, and thinking of Dying for a Drink, you have social issues, you have legal issues, you have politics, and then you have these two protagonists. And yet it's a very slender book. So is that part of it too, that you are the concision of your writing? Is that owing a little bit to your training too?
Well, to some extent, for your information, when we put together submissions in the court, what they call the factum, you are very strictly limited to how long they can be. You've got to put your argument together in 20 paragraphs, 20 fairly medium-sized paragraphs. That's it, not 21. 20 is your limit. So once again, who wants to read all these things? If you've got a good point, you can make it in 10 minutes or 15 minutes. I frequently have said that in court. Give me 10 or 15 minutes, I'll make a point and convince you. And after 15 minutes, if I haven't convinced you, I guess I never will. But I guess the other aspect of it with regard to concise writing is that I did my basic training, if you can call it that, as a writer with the University of Toronto Press and their editors. And they were very, very demanding.
Mm-hmm.
And they would go through paragraph by paragraph and say, why is that sentence there? You don't really need it, do you? So they would be merciless with their authors and looking at them and paring things down. And that was kind of my basic training with regard to saying, you've got this document that sounds great to you at 20 pages. You can say the same thing in 10 pages. So for better or for worse, that's kind of followed me ever since.
Thanks for that.
Okay, Chris, would you step up again with one of your questions?
Yeah, thank you. There's been a lot going on in the 1900s. You've written a couple books about it. From my understanding, the way I read the last one, there's one more coming.
Well, it's a work in progress.
No. Okay, well, I hope you get it finished and get it out.
Okay.
Because no, but we have a lot on earlier stuff. Like myself, I usually stop at Confederation.
Okay.
And I write tour books. It's much like a walking tour,
okay,
but it's much longer because you have to get in your car, or if you're really good at biking, you're going all over the county. For example, the theme I used on War of 1812. Well, it happened all over. The fur trade and a few others like that. But I'm wondering, what would you, if this was 20 or 30 years from now, what would you think is important to write on a theme in one of your books where you're covering decades or whatever, from say 1970s or something to now? A lot has changed, but I don't know if it's been radically changed, has it?
Well, that's a good point, because I really don't think it has. Especially in this area. My last book about the Windsor area, the border cities powerhouse,
Mm-hmm.
was a fascinating book to write, because you're taking from the beginning of the auto industry in 1904 to the Ford strike in 1945. It's just a tumultuous period of change in this area. Windsor, at 1900, it's a village in the middle of nowhere. It's minuscule place. 12,000 people. And 30 years later, it's the 8th largest city in Canada. It's and the 4th largest industrial complex in the country. It goes from next to being nothing to this massive industrial complex out of nowhere. So it was an incredible revolutionary period in local history and in national history. You look at the political and social unrest in Windsor, it really says a lot about Canada in general. Since 1950, it's really been more of the same. I mean, we've had our ups and downs, and the municipality has grown, and sometimes it has receded. But you really don't see the same kind of dramatic changes happening in our society since that period of time. So it's a little bit more difficult to write about, which is not to say it's not important. I'm sure that there were important changes in the community, and certainly you see some in society. Society is a lot different in the 21st century than it was in the middle of the 20th century, for example. But yeah, it's a little bit difficult to write about because it just lacks quite a bit of the drama what happened in the 1900 to 1945 phase.
Yeah, thank you. And, I agree with your comments. Absolutely. There's been so much change, not just in, this area of Windsor, Essex County, but throughout the world through those different eras. And now it seems like we're just sort of gliding along. We have bumps in the road politically and socially. And other than that, it's been fairly steady. And like I say before, keeping some of these stories alive is very important. And I'm glad you, caught on some stories. I love that Powerhouse book. It's great. It covers a lot. And, it's nice to see local historians writing on specific topics as well as the general. We need that stuff. And I thank you for doing that.
Well, thank you. It's just not good grist for writers when everything is just kind of going along. We need more Reverend Spracklins out there.
Yes, we do.
I'm going to call on Mary Lou now. Earlier, we were talking about Clara Ford, and I know you have some particular interests in women's issues. So why don't you start with your questions with Patrick Brode?
I was recently read the book Courted and Abandoned, which is it's very interesting because it's the role of women and their legal rights, and how the tort law regarding their legal rights as married or individual persons about their body. How did you work with how do you think that the changes in the tort law towards women have affected or allowed women to increase during that industrial period? Because it really did happen around the same time.
Well, it was amazing. Just for everybody's information, for those who are not aware, seduction was a tort where it recognized in Canadian law that young women were basically the property of their fathers. Mm-hmm. And if they became impregnated out of wedlock, that their fathers could sue for damages. Like if you did something to somebody's car. That was the nature of the seduction tort as it existed in this country. And it was really a reflection of the fact of women being effectively chattels. Mm-hmm. And it seemed to evolve over time. And as you indicated, Mary Lou, it became something radically different over time. It became eventually, by the Victorian period, a device whereby women could, on their own initiative, sue men for having failed to live up to their promises to marry them or to look after their child. It became a little avenue for them to at least exert their own authority. And of course, as time went by the early 20th century, where it was becoming more and more archaic, mm-hmm. and there were actually statutes being enacted to enable women to exert rights to get maintenance and support from men, that women were starting to use the tort in their own right, mm-hmm. which was kind of odd, or at least unexpected, that all of a sudden they could kind of turn this thing on its head, where previously it had kept women as objects, mm-hmm. and said, no, you can be litigants as well. You can actually sue the man who's failed to live up to his undertakings to you. That was kind of a change of pace.
Yeah, your father's father could sue. I also found it very interesting that the father could sue and actually decide whether the economic reparations or the amount that they felt was suitable. The father was the one in charge of saying, yeah, that $15, that's good enough. We're all good here now. We won't bother you. I always found that almost equates to the value, that itself equates to the value of what the men of that time, the fathers of that time, had towards their daughters and their wives, that they were purely property, so that they could even, to me, sell your own reputation for enough. And it almost seems like that, and with the financial compensation.
That's the way it was in those days. And and we all remember the mayor of Casterbridge.
Yes.
If you want to go out there and sell your wife, you just get the best price you can.
Or her honor, as they.
Yeah, good old Thomas Hardy. That's the way it was back then.
Now, when you're looking at this, and then only, approximately 50, 60 years, like within or even just in the World War I period, where you see women starting to be more involved in industry because of World War I. And afterwards, you're seeing this evolution of culture, where you have the flappers and prohibition and all of this, let's say, nightlife. Where do you see how women came out of a non-voting or period and going into that type of, how does that reflect, do you think, on the social issues that took place with women at that time?
Well, it's interesting because by the 1920s, you see a real change in these particular laws that we were just talking about, Mary. And a lot of judges are pointing out the fact that by the 1920s, women were actually acting as independent actors. And they would occasionally choose their own relationships. They were not being foisted upon them. So the whole notion that women were just simply passive characters or objects was really not the reality anymore. Women were actors in their own rights, getting into situations of their own choosing. And the law was really pretty slow to recognize that. I mean, by the 1930s, just to change gears slightly, in Border City's powerhouse, it struck me that by the 1930s, you see women actually coming forward for the first time as important figures in government, in society, running things. By the Depression, you've got women in charge of important areas, in important political figures as well in their own right. So I really found that by the 1930s, it's really 1920s, you see it beginning with women acting as independent bodies, actors. 1930s, they've arrived. They're actually doing things, are significant figures in their own rights.
If we can jump ahead to the 1940s, Mary Lou, I think you also had a question about his work on the slasher killings.
Yes, one of my favorites. What I had was how much the local media actually was part of understanding the slasher killings. Because if you're looking at this local serial killer, who's obviously who's choosing, or as they call it, unsub, is choosing a specific character of individuals that are, but if you list it in the newspaper and you're reading about it, it's the idea of homosexuality, or the idea of acknowledging homosexuality, is never really apparent. It's always perverts, deviants, or psychopaths. So how much do you think the media influenced this case in regards to how it was presented?
Well, there was a huge influence. In 1945, at the time of the slasher killings, which, for background information, was the serial killer in Windsor, who caused an enormous amount of anxiety in this city, when there were a series of killings, completely baffled the authorities, and went on for a considerable period of time. And it turned out that the victims were all homosexual men who were being preyed upon by someone who obviously wanted to find them out and kill them. And there was an enormous reaction from the press, from the Windsor Star, which was the primary source of information in those days, an enormously influential outlet in Windsor in those days. I don't think we can appreciate how central it was to how people got information in the 1940s. And the Windsor Star was consistently advocating for the elimination of deviants in society, as they called them. They made no distinctions. Everybody who was a homosexual was potentially also a pedophile. So children were very much at risk, according to the newspapers. Our children will be molested, they will be attacked. And there were a number of editorials coming out in the newspaper about this particular incident. One of them was headlined, "Perverts Are a Menace."
Wow.
That we have to get rid of them. And the editorial was very distinctive. We have to find out people who are deviants or homosexuals and get them out of society. Whether we have to kill them or incarcerate them or just do something, they have to get out of decent society. So it was pretty chilling stuff, because it's really, at that point, the enormity of the Nazi Holocaust was becoming apparent.
Mhm.
And the fact that a society had eliminated, almost completely eliminated another ethnic group. You've got the Windsor Star advocating for eliminating from society a group of people they found sexually obnoxious. So it's pretty chilling stuff to read.
Yeah. The behavior of the media at that time, it sounded a lot like the way like almost like a genocidal type of, no matter what, and very much like the Jerry Spracklin behavior. You know, it was like a reaction, that kind of violent or huge reaction, instead of some kind of, let's try and figure out what's going on and see if Windsor's going to be safe. It was more about, go out there and find these people that are already victims and make more of them, which had a huge influence on the literate population.
Well, it did. I mean, especially they're running stories that when they finally catch the killer, almost hinting that, well, maybe he was just a bit misguided. Basically, he was not that far off on the right track. It's very sends chills up your spine to read some of these things. And mind you, this was kind of mainstream for 1945 or 1946. So.
Another institution that comes into play is the police force themselves. And Chris, I think you had a question you wanted to ask about the police force.
What it's about is the police service itself. I've read your books that we've been talking about for the last few minutes on the events happening in Windsor and the public and the police's response to them. But also, I read Border City Police that was put out, and it's an excellent book as well. And when I read that particular book, it sounds like the Windsor's police are the most corrupt police in Canada, which I'm sure is not true. But they had a problem with their mayor. The military came in. The two incidents that you wrote about specifically there, we had rum running, all those kinds of things. Even Franklin W. Dixon wrote a book on our rum running problems. But my point and my question, I guess, is our city in Canada any worse than anywhere else in Canada for the way it was, the police were operating in those time periods?
Well, I guess it's a question of what you think is worse. The police in Windsor were quite corrupt. They were taking bribes, and they were the best police money could buy to a great extent. There's no question about it. The police force was laying off certain areas. There were certain areas where prostitution and gambling was apparent, like right across from the police station, and they did nothing. Now, to some extent, of course, that reflected their society. Police don't come from a different place. They come from within the city of Windsor. And all of this activity that they saw going around them was perfectly acceptable by and large to this community. And they simply took no steps to stop it. So they were creatures very much of their own society. Were they better or worse than any other place? I don't know. You could find a lot of similar activity in the Tenderloin districts in Toronto, Vancouver, Winnipeg. At one point earlier in the 20th century, Winnipeg had a practically licensed red light district. So whether it was any worse or not, hard to say. certainly the provincial government, when they cracked down on Windsor Police in the 1950s, had it up to here with the level of corruption in the Windsor Police Department, fired everybody who was involved in it. You could have fired a lot of people, I imagine, in Toronto or even London for much of the same things. Was Windsor worse? Well, it was the one that was actually seemed to stand out the most.
All right, well, thank you. And when the Army did come in, I believe the mayor was involved and police chief and some of that. Would that be something well worth writing about, or just let the Border Police book, just what it covered, say enough is enough?
Well, I don't know. I did write about it. I've got another book out there called Unholy City that talks about that in some detail, and why the government decided to clamp down on Windsor.
Yeah, I'll have to look that up then and see what you got in there. I'm looking forward to that now.
Okay, sure.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your time, and I appreciate your comments on the lawlessness of this area.
Okay, thank you. You're welcome.
Rob, you look like you've got something you want to add in, or do you just want to ask about the research process?
Well, since you mentioned Thomas Hardy and the mayor of Casterbridge, I wanted to ask Mr. Brode to what extent his reading influences his writing.
Well, it's not only influences it, it kind of pervades it. I don't think you can look at what's going on in culture or in writing without seeing how it affects the legal basis of what's going on. For example, I mentioned to Mary Lou about the growing role of women in the 1920s, and all I could think of was the it girls of the 1920s, where women were really coming forward, especially in films and in theater, into their own right, and people were starting to sit back and say, women aren't these porcelain creatures on a pedestal. They're actually living, breathing human beings who have their own desires and ambitions. So once again, reading some films, I think really reflect what's been going on. I don't think you can write a book even about history without seeing the context of what's going on in literature around it. So yeah, I think there's a lot to be said there.
In terms of style, I know in another interview you mentioned Michael Bliss's book on Banting and Insulin. Was you regarded that very, very highly. But in terms of style, does your reading in fiction, does it influence your writing, not only in terms of style, but also the structure, the way you structure your historical work?
Well, that could be. Some fiction writers like George Mcdonald, Fraser, who's done a lot of the Flashman novels. I find his really enjoyable, and the fact that he uses a fictional story, but based in the reality of a historical incident, to actually illuminate what happened. It's just great. You can read about stuff that I certainly was not aware of, and really fascinating stories, mostly about the swashbuckling tales of the British Empire, but based upon real historical incidents. I found very interesting to read and have influenced my style, although I have to say, I think that you end up writing your own way. I think you walk, or your stride or something is a particular manner that you develop by yourself, and I think your writing is very much the same. One of my colleagues from the University of Toronto was reading some of my more recent books, and he was referring to my Brodian prose, and I never really thought about it very much, but he said that you have a distinctive style. Said I could read a couple of pages from one of your books without your name on it and know that you wrote it, just because of the way it's written. I never thought about that very much before, but I suppose it's true.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Okay.
And if I could jump in, you have covered the slasher incident not only as a work of nonfiction, but also as a novel, a fiction. What was your thinking of why you wanted to try it as a novel, and what did the novel form offer you that was different?
I just thought I would take a chance and try and channel my inner Hilary Mantel and kind of look at a historical incident that I knew pretty well and say, what if you just simply looked at it as being kind of a story? And I did it as a fictional piece. And I guess as a way of, you can kind of cut loose. You can illustrate what's happening and embellish it. Try and stick to the historical reality of what happened, although you're not bound by it. Once again, fiction is that, it's just a made-up story. But you can read upon that and kind of read things into what the character's inner thoughts are that you couldn't otherwise do in a straight history book. You can actually give them more feelings and insights, and it becomes maybe a bit more compelling. And although as long as people accept the fact that it's not a straight story of what occurred, it's something that's interesting, but along the way, it also might give people some insights on what actually occurred. That's why I wanted to do it.
Wonderful, wonderful. We have, thanks to Rob and others, what we have a Proust moment where we ask you some questions that tell us a little bit about yourself. But before we get into the Proust questions, of Mary Lou, Chris, or Rob, anything more you'd like to ask Mr. Brode at this time?
It's Chris. No, thank you. I'm fine. I've enjoyed listening to the questions and the answers especially.
Rob, Mary Lou?
Let's get to Proust.
Okay, the Proust. Okay. So the Proust questions we have. What is your favorite word or phrase?
What phrase? I don't know. I would say, perhaps. I hate to be definitive on things. As we know from a recent election in the United States, you never know how things are going to turn out. It's great to write a history book in retrospect and see, well, this did happen, but you never really know, do you? So I guess perhaps I live in uncertain times and uncertain outcomes.
Which historical figure do you most identify with?
I would, obviously, I think the obvious answer is Sir John Thompson.
Well, you're going to have to elaborate on that one for me.
Yeah.
Well, you're kidding, of course you. Household name. Sir John was Canada's 5th Prime Minister. And I find it really quite interesting in that he was one of those guys who was a fixer. He fixed everything. He got everything done. He was the go-to guy in Canada. And under Sir John Mcdonald, he managed to keep the government afloat. He managed to take people like Dalton McCarthy, who were trying to rip Canada from stem to stern, and managed to drive them into oblivion. So Sir John Thompson was the guy. And a lot of people didn't like him for his background, for who he was, but Mcdonald had tapped him to be Prime Minister upon his succession. And when Mcdonald died, Thompson became Canada's 3rd Prime Minister. And in honor of that, he was knighted by the Queen. And the day of his knighthood, he dropped dead. So that was it. Oh, come on, it's not funny.
I'm sorry, but
I mean, that's the story. I mean, he's a
Went
great
out
guy.
at the top of his game.
And then gone. Had tea with the Queen, and that was it.
What's the one book you tell everyone to read?
Well, you mentioned it a little while ago, but I say the best history book in Canada you should read is The Discovery of Insulin, which you like a book that says what it is. It's a book about the discovery of insulin by Michael Bliss, because it's a wonderful book about Frederick Banting, who is a former medical officer, failed general practitioner, who out of the blue has this incredible medical discovery, one of the most important things that any Canadian has ever done. And Michael Bliss wrote this book both as a very good, reliable history book. He's an excellent historian, he was, and is once a very good read. I actually looked at that book and said, that's what I want to write I want to be able to write that kind of a book, which is such a good history book, and yet is something that's well worth reading. Whether you're interested in medicine or Canada, it's just simply a great book to read.
So would I be right in then believing that that's a book that continues to inspire you?
It does, and I've occasionally gone back to it. The one section in it, he's writing about the impact of the discovery in about 1922, I guess, when they finally had insulin. And he, how do you illustrate that? How do you indicate what a incredible accomplishment it was? And he simply took one lady in Rochester, New York, whom he couldn't name in the first edition. He could name her in later editions. The daughter of Chief Justice Charles Evans Hughes in the United States. She comes from one of the most richest, powerful families in the country. And she was 16 years old and on the point of death from diabetes. It was just a death sentence. It doesn't matter how wealthy she is, how powerful her father is, you're going to die. And they hear about these two characters in Toronto who have suddenly developed this thing that controls diabetes. And her doctor says, what have you got to lose? And she gets sent to Toronto. She takes it, and within 6 months, she's almost completely recovered. And she lives a full life and dies about 90 years old with 5 kids. So there's this drug that people were just dying, and there was no cure for it. All of a sudden, they can live. And it was just he uses that incident through her to illustrate what a significant find this was.
Now I'm going to ask you to cast your mind back and be really imaginative. If you could talk with your 10-year-old self, what would you say to you?
Well, I would say, listen to my brother, Michael, who was 9 years older than I was, so he would have been 19. He had a voracious appetite for reading and history, and he would share that with me. And I don't have to be suggested to it because I did. He taught me a great deal, and I learned a lot from him. And he was the one who rather brought me around and fostered all my tastes and influence, and influenced me a great deal from the age of 10 on.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Brode. I've had fun. I've learned a lot, and I hope others feeling the same. Thank you so much for your time. We look forward to any new books that you create in the future.
Okay.
And
thank you.
Thank you for being here.
Thank everyone. I appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
For more information, please check out our Accessing Authors book list or visit your local branch for more of these titles. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned for more episodes of Accessing Authors by subscribing to our Facebook and YouTube channel.